Imagine two people. Both invest $500 a month for 40 years. Both put their money in the exact same S&P 500 index fund. Both get the exact same average annual return over their lifetimes. Let's say 8%. Same contributions. Same fund. Same average return. One of them retires with $1.4 million. The other retires with $2.6 million. Same inputs. Nearly double the outcome. And the only thing that was different was the order in which the good years and bad years happened to arrive. This is called a sequence of returns risk, and it's one of the most under-discussed ideas in passive investing. Partly because index fund advocates, myself included, spend so much energy convincing people that average annual return is the number that matters. It isn't, not entirely. The order matters too, and the order is something you have zero control over. I've spent the last week going through retirement research from places like Morningstar and the Trinity Study literature, along with work from researchers like Wade Pfau, who has spent his career on exactly this question. The conclusion isn't index funds don't work. It's that the way most people think about how index funds work is missing a variable, and that missing variable might matter more than your savings rate. Before we get into the math, if deep dives like this are useful to you, subscribe. It's the best return on investment you'll get for $0. The Steel Man. Why average return is a lie. You tell yourself. Here's the core of the fear, and it starts with how we're taught to think about compound growth. Every retirement calculator you've ever used works the same way. You put in your monthly contribution, you put in an expected annual return, usually somewhere around 7 to 8% for a stock index fund. And the calculator smooths that return evenly across every single year. Year 1, up 8%. Year 2, up 8%. Year 40, up 8%. It produces a clean, reassuring curve that goes up and to the right forever. The market does not do this. The market has never done this. Not once in its entire history has it returned a smooth 8% every year. Some years it's up 25%. Some years it's down 35%. The average of those years might land somewhere around 8%, but the path between those years looks nothing like the smooth curve your calculator drew. And here's where it gets dangerous. For most of your investing life, the path doesn't matter very much. It only starts to matter enormously at two specific moments, right when you're approaching retirement and right when you're starting to withdraw. This is the part almost nobody explains clearly, so let's actually walk through the mechanism. Imagine two investors, both starting retirement with exactly $1 million, both withdrawing $40,000 a year, both invested in the same index fund, both experiencing the exact same 5-year sequence of returns, just in reverse order from each other. Investor A retires into a sequence that goes minus 20%, minus 10%, plus 5%, plus 15%, plus 25%. Investor B retires into the exact same 5 numbers, just flipped. Plus 25%, plus 15%, plus 5%, minus 10%, minus 20%. Over those 5 years, both investors experienced the identical average return. If you average those 5 numbers, you'd get the same result either way. Averages don't care about order. But Investor A is in serious trouble, and Investor B is fine. Here's why. Investor A starts withdrawing $40,000 in year 1, right as the portfolio drops 20%. So now they're pulling money out of a portfolio that's already shrunk to $800,000. And that $40,000 withdrawal is now a larger percentage of a smaller pool. Then year 2, another 10% drop on a portfolio that's already smaller and has already had money pulled out of it. By the time the good years arrive in years 4 and 5, Investor A has so few shares left that the recovery barely moves the needle. The portfolio never gets the chance to compound on its original size because a meaningful chunk of it was sold off at depressed prices during the worst years. Investor B has the opposite experience. The good years come first. The portfolio grows from $1 million toward $1.3 to $1.4 million before any bad years hit. When the minus 10% and minus 20% years finally arrive, they're hitting a much larger base. And the withdrawals, but still $40,000 a year, represent a much smaller percentage of that larger pool. Investor B sails through the same bad years that wrecked Investor A because the order was different. This is sequence of returns risk in its purest form. The same average return, applied in a different order, with withdrawals happening along the way, produces wildly different outcomes, because withdrawals interact with returns in a way that simple averages completely hide. Now here's why this connects to the rich, slower than you think idea, and why it's not just a retirement phase problem. The exact same mechanism, just in reverse, applies during your accumulation years, especially the first 10 to 15 years of investing, and especially during the final 10 to 15 years before retirement. Early in your investing life, your portfolio is small, so even a brutal crash doesn't cost you much in dollar terms, and you have decades for the recovery to compound. But in the decade or two right before retirement, your portfolio is at its largest size right before you stop adding new money and start needing to rely on it. If a major crash happens to land in those specific years, like not on average, but specifically then, the dollar impact is enormous, and unlike Investor B, you don't have decades left for it to recover before you need the money. Go back to our two hypothetical savers from the cold open. Same $500 a month, same 40 years, same average 8% return. The one who ended up with $2.6 million simply got lucky. The market happened to deliver several of its best years during the final decade of their accumulation period, when their portfolio was largest and every percentage point translated into real dollars. The one who ended up with $1.4 million had the misfortune of a major downturn landing in their final working decade, right when it would do maximum dollar damage, with the least amount of time left to recover before retirement. Same discipline, same fund, same average return over 40 years, a $1.2 million difference, purely from when, in the sequence of 40 years, the good years and bad years happened to fall. If this is true, if the order of returns can swing your outcome by close to double and you have zero control over that order, then the entire pitch of just put money in an index fund and the math works out starts to look incomplete. You could do everything right, save consistently, stay the course, never panic sell, and still end up with dramatically less than someone who did the exact same things, purely because of when you were born relative to the market's mood swings. That's the fear. And it's not a fringe theory. It's the entire reason the retirement planning industry exists. And it's the reason the 4% rule comes with 100 footnotes about which historical period you're testing it against. But before you conclude that index investing is a crapshoot determined entirely by your birth year, there's a piece of this that the Steelman conveniently leaves out, and it changes the entire picture. The debunk, the variable you actually control. Here's the core problem with the way I just framed that, and it's a problem of perspective, not of math. The math I walked through is completely correct. The framing, that you're a passive passenger to whatever sequence the market deals you, is where it falls apart. Let's go back to the house analogy because it's useful here too. Imagine your retirement portfolio is a house, and the sequence of returns is the weather. Some years it rains, some years it's sunny, and you don't get to choose which. The Steelman version of this story treats you as someone standing outside in that weather with no house at all. Fully exposed, whatever happens to you directly and immediately. But that's not how retirement portfolios actually work for someone who's planned even moderately well. You're not standing in the weather. You're inside a house, and the house has a roof, walls, and, critically, a pantry stocked with food so you don't have to go outside during the storm. The pantry here is your asset allocation, and this is the variable the Steelman almost entirely ignores. The sequence of returns problem assumes a 100% stock portfolio with fixed dollar withdrawals, regardless of what the market just did. Almost nobody who has thought about this for more than 5 minutes actually does that. Here's the research that matters. Wade Pfau and other retirement researchers have shown that the severity of sequence risk is massively reduced, not eliminated, but massively reduced, by two things. Holding a meaningful allocation to bonds or cash, and adjusting withdrawals based on portfolio performance, rather than withdrawing a fixed dollar amount no matter what. Let's rerun Investor A, the one who got the brutal minus 20%, minus 10% sequence right out of the gate. But this time, Investor A has 25% of their portfolio in bonds and cash. And instead of always pulling $40,000 from whatever's left, they pull that $40,000 from the bond/cash portion first during the down years. In year one, the market drops 20%, but Investor A's withdrawal doesn't come from the stock portion at all. It comes from cash. The stock portion, which just dropped 20%, isn't touched. It has the entire recovery period, years 3 through 5, the plus 5%, plus 15%, plus 25% years, to recover without having shares sold off at the bottom. By the time the good years arrive, Investor A still has roughly the same number of shares they started with, because the withdrawals during the bad years came from the pantry, not from selling discounted stock. This single adjustment, holding a cash/bond buffer and drawing from it during down years, doesn't eliminate the difference between Investor A and Investor B, but research suggests it closes a huge portion of the gap. The $1.2 million difference from our cold open shrinks dramatically once you stop assuming a 100% stock portfolio that mechanically sells shares at whatever price the market happens to offer that day, good or bad. Here's the test I want to apply. The same way we'd test any scary financial theory. If sequence of returns risk were truly an unsolvable, uncontrollable lottery, if your outcome really did come down entirely to your birth year and nothing else, then everyone retiring in a bad sequence decade should have run out of money. But that's not what the historical data shows. The retirees who got hit hardest by bad early sequences and still made it through were disproportionately the ones who had a meaningful allocation to bonds and who showed at least some flexibility in spending during the bad years, cutting back a bit when the portfolio was down, rather than mechanically withdrawing the same dollar amount regardless. This connects to something John Bogle talked about constantly, which is that the average return framing isn't wrong. It's just incomplete on its own. Bogle's actual point was never ignore risk because the average works out. His point was that costs are the one variable that's both controllable and guaranteed to matter in every sequence in every decade, regardless of what the market does. Sequence of returns risk is real, but it's a risk about timing and withdrawal behavior, both of which you have meaningful influence over, not a risk about the index fund itself being broken. So the free rider reveal here is this. The entire scary version of the sequence problem relies on an assumption: 100% stocks, fixed withdrawals, no behavioral flexibility, that almost nobody who's done basic retirement planning actually uses. The scary version isn't describing index fund investors. It's describing index fund investors with no plan, which is a different problem entirely and one that has nothing to do with whether index funds themselves are a good vehicle. If you're 25 years old and putting $500 a month into an S&P 500 fund inside a 401k, with 35 years until retirement, sequence risk in the scary sense barely applies to you at all. You have decades for any bad sequence to average out, and no withdrawals happening to compound the damage. The sequence problem isn't really an index fund problem. It's a last decade before retirement and first decade of retirement problem, which is a much narrower window than your entire 40-year investing life. The reframe. The real risk is two decisions, not one lottery. So is the sequence problem nothing to worry about? Not quite. And this is where we can't just wave the average returns workout, don't worry flag and go back to sleep. Because while the mechanism isn't as deterministic as the scary version makes it sound, there's a real risk hiding underneath it, and it has almost nothing to do with the market and almost everything to do with two specific human decisions. Think of it like a relay race. The runner who's running right now isn't the only one who matters. The handoff matters too. Most of a relay race is just running, and running is mostly about pace, which averages out fine over a long race. But the handoff at the 10 or 15 feet where one runner passes the baton to the next is where races are actually won or lost, disproportionately to how much of the total distance it represents. Your investing life has two handoffs. The first is the handoff from pure accumulation to approaching retirement, usually the decade from about age 55 to 65. The second is the handoff from approaching retirement to actively withdrawing, the first 5 to 10 years of retirement itself. Both handoffs represent a small fraction of your total investing timeline, and both are where almost all of the sequence risk actually lives. The first sub-risk, the allocation handoff. Here's the you think X but actually Y of this one. You might think the danger is what if the market crashes during my last working decade? That's the headline risk. But the actual risk is narrower and more controllable. It's specifically what percentage of your portfolio is in stocks during that window, and whether that percentage was chosen deliberately or just left wherever it happened to drift. We saw a version of this in 2008. People in their late 50s and early 60s who had never adjusted their allocation, who were still 90 to 100% in stocks because that's where they'd always been. And the 2000s had mostly been fine for them. Got hit with a 50% plus drawdown in the exact years when their portfolios were at their largest, and they had the least time to recover before needing the money. People in the same age range who'd gradually shifted towards 60-40 or 50-50 over the preceding decade experienced the same crash, on the same calendar, with roughly half the dollar impact, because half their money wasn't in the falling asset. This isn't a story about the market being unfair. The market did the same thing to both groups. It's a story about one group having made a decision about their allocation during the handoff window, and the other group having made no decision at all, which in investing is itself a decision, just an invisible one. The second sub-risk, the withdrawal rate handoff. You might think the danger here is, what if I pick the wrong withdrawal percentage? 4% versus 3.5% versus 5%. That's the headline version, and it's the version most 4% rule content focuses on. But the actual risk is about rigidity, not the specific number. We saw this with retirees who began withdrawals right around 2000 or right around 2008. Both periods that, in hindsight, were rough times to start a 30-year withdrawal sequence. The retirees who treated their withdrawal rate as a fixed, unchangeable number, I calculated 4% of my starting balance, and I'm withdrawing that exact dollar amount every year, adjusted only for inflation, forever, were the ones whose portfolios came closest to running dry in the research. The retirees who treated 4% as a starting point rather than a contract, who skipped an inflation adjustment in a year the portfolio was down, or trimmed discretionary spending for a year or two during a downturn, dramatically improved their odds, even with the same starting withdrawal rate and the same sequence of market returns. So now we have what looks like a lose-lose. On one hand, you can't control the market's sequence. On the other hand, the obvious fix, just hire someone to manage this for you, a financial advisor who specializes in retirement income, runs into the same problem we'd find with any just get an active manager solution. Many advisors, when markets get scary, face the same pressure their clients do. Clients call panicking, and advisors who are human and who don't want to lose the client sometimes make exactly the same fixed withdrawal, didn't adjust the allocation mistakes, just with an extra layer of fees on top. Paying 1% a year for someone to also not adjust your allocation during the handoff decade doesn't solve the sequence problem. It just adds a fee drag on top of it. So it's not the market versus you, and it's not you versus an advisor. It's that the entire risk is concentrated into two specific decisions, in two specific windows, and the fix has to target those windows directly, not the portfolio in general and not the market in general. The resolution framework, 3 adjustments for the 2 handoffs. You don't have to choose between ignore sequence risk entirely and obsess over which decade you happen to retire in. Here's how to address the 2 handoffs directly. Adjustment 1, the glide path, the free lunch. Roughly 10 to 15 years before your target retirement date, start gradually shifting a portion of your portfolio from stocks into bonds, not all at once and not based on market timing, but on a schedule. This is exactly what target date funds are designed to do automatically, which is one of the few things they get right, even amid all the other criticism of cap-weighted index concentration. The mechanism, this directly addresses the first handoff. By the time you're in the highest risk window, a meaningful chunk of your portfolio is no longer exposed to the specific crash that would do the most dollar damage at that specific moment. The caveat, a glide path means giving up some upside if the market does well during those years instead of crashing. You're paying an insurance premium, whether or not the bad event happens. That's what insurance is. Adjustment 2, the cash buffer, for the more deliberate. Hold 1 to 3 years of planned withdrawals in cash or short-term bonds, separate from your invested portfolio, specifically to be spent during years when your stock portfolio is down. The mechanism. This directly addresses the second handoff by giving you a pantry so you're never forced to sell stocks at depressed prices to cover living expenses. The caveat, cash earns less than stocks over time, so building and maintaining this buffer has a real cost during good years. The same way Investor B's smooth ride had a cost, lower expected growth, that Investor A's all-stock approach didn't have until the bad sequence hit. Adjustment 3, flexible withdrawals. Boring, but the only thing that works in a bad sequence. Decide in advance on rules for adjusting withdrawals. For example, skipping an inflation adjustment in any year, your portfolio is down, or capping withdrawals at a slightly lower rate during the first 5 years of retirement specifically, since that's the highest risk window for sequence damage. The mechanism, this addresses the rigidity problem directly. It's not about picking a safer percentage. It's about building in the flexibility that the research shows matters more than the specific starting number. The caveat, this requires a year or two of reduced spending, precisely during years that are already stressful, which is psychologically harder than it sounds, which is exactly why deciding the rules in advance before you're in a stressful year matters. Here's the principle that survives this entire debate. Regardless of which decade you happen to retire in, low costs are the one advantage that helps in every single sequence. A retiree paying 0.1% in fees and one paying 1.5% in fees, facing the identical sequence of returns, end up in meaningfully different places. And unlike the sequence itself, The fee is something you choose every single year, in every single scenario. So, will index funds make you rich slower than you think? The honest answer, for most of your investing life, no. The average return framing is basically fine, and sequence risk barely touches you. But during two specific decade-long windows, the one right before retirement and the one right after, the order of returns can matter as much as your savings rate. And pretending otherwise, by treating your allocation and withdrawals as static, set it and forget it numbers during exactly those windows is where the real risk lives. If this lowered your blood pressure a little or raised it in a useful way, hit like. It helps the algorithm find other people quietly worrying about retirement math at 11 p.m. And I want to know in the comments, are you currently inside one of the two handoff windows within about 15 years of retirement? Or within the first 10 years of being retired? If so, has anyone actually walked you through your glide path and withdrawal rules? Or is it still sitting on the I'll deal with it later pile? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious how many of us are closer to that window than we think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.